Good morning, everyone. I know that probably by now everyone is a bit tired. It has been a couple of really good days, and today is the last day. So just when some of us are overcoming jet lag and getting our energy back, we are ready to go back home, right? Welcome to today's session on making the case for Indigenous peoples and local communities' land rights in the climate and conservation agendas. We have a group of fantastic panelists that are ready to share their experiences and their perspectives on this. But before getting there, I would love if some of you can raise your hand when I ask a couple of questions. The first question is, who is already working hard on the topic of Indigenous peoples and local communities' land rights? Great. And I know that there is interpretation, and I tend to speak very fast. So for the sake of the interpreters, we should all speak slowly. So I saw many hands up. And the next question is, who here in the audience is actually part of an Indigenous peoples organization or belongs to an Indigenous peoples community or to a local tribe? So if you can raise your hands, that would be fantastic. Gracias por eso. Great. So in a way, it is great that we are all here together. I realize that we are talking a bit among ourselves, which is also nice in these spaces where we have to interact with folks that are not linked at all with the topic. So I hope that today we can come together, we can celebrate what we know, and then hopefully we can go out and try to convince others to be also our allies. On that note, I decided that I was not going to be talking about the importance of Indigenous peoples and local communities because I had the sense that we were all going to be more or less on the same page. But I decided to put on a video to start us off with some inspiration on the issue. So let me see whether this works.
What does home mean to you? A safe harbour for your catch after a day's fishing? Or the rush hour commute across a megacity to your apartment? The simple warmth of a campfire? Or sitting around a table with family? What if the answer was more complicated? What if home was constantly changing? What if you shared it with 80% of the world's fauna and wild animals? For Earth's 450 million Indigenous people, home has never been a building, rather a self-sustaining ecosystem, where their guardianship of a quarter of the world's lands is vital to the survival of the planet. Since the dawn of humankind, Indigenous peoples have been shaped by their relationship to the land and water. A way of life passed down by ancestors, based on securing resources for future generations, taking only what is needed from nature and always giving back. Today, Indigenous territories provide 1 in 4 of us with food, water and fuel, while storing enough carbon to potentially stem the worst of the climate crisis. Yet, Indigenous guardianship of the earth is hanging by a thread. For ancient communities, time is running out. Indigenous peoples are under siege and under threat. As government, corporations, and even non-profit organizations systematically fail to recognize their territories as sovereign or understand and respect customary tenure systems carried down through generations. Each day, Indigenous people defend their homes with their lives, and they're subjected to violence, kidnap, and murder. This must stop. It is clear we have lost our way as a species. We have forgotten what it means to have a relationship with nature. Positive change begins with respecting Indigenous people's rights, and by recognising their cultures as the cradle of our own existence, while seeking inspiration from their mastery of living in reciprocity with the earth, without stripping it bare and leaving nothing behind. The diversity of Indigenous people's land tenure needs to be recognised by all, from respecting existing customary tenure systems in Melanesia to recognising the land rights of Indigenous peoples from Amazonia and beyond. This is an argument we must take to the heart of our greatest cities. Speaking truth to power whenever tenure security laws are being ignored, ensuring communities hold on to hard-won constitutional and legal recognition of their rights and collective territories. Almost 8 billion of us from all creeds and cultures travel on the same hopeful journey, sharing a human desire for safety and stability, to live in peace with our loved ones, surrounded by a healthy environment. If allowed to thrive unhindered, Indigenous peoples can guide us on this path towards a fairer and more balanced existence. A world where each of us can truly find ourselves where we belong.
Hope that you all are enjoying the film. I am Margarita Mora. I am the Senior Managing Director of Partnerships at Niatero. Niatero is an organization that was established to work as a trusted partner of Indigenous peoples committed to maintaining their lands and their waters. So this is basically the full soul of our mission as an organization. Today with me, we have 5 fantastic panelists that I want to invite here to the front. We have Joe Eisen, José Luis Rengifo, Alan Freshenet, Cindy Giulianti, and Katie Raitar. So if you can all join me here, that would be fantastic. You can sit wherever you want. I also recognize that there were microphones in each seat and that I was holding one a moment ago that I already lost, but for sure it's gonna appear again. And thank you for that. And with that, all of the panelists here today are fully embedded in working on Indigenous peoples and local communities' rights to land in different parts of the world, some of them working in specific countries, many of them working globally, right? So I want to invite each of them to share some thoughts with all of us. They are going to make a presentation of about 8 minutes. And hopefully while they are presenting, you can gather some notes and some questions so that we have a nice Q&A after the presentations. So our first panelist is Joe Eisen. He's the Executive Director of Rainforest Foundation UK. And for 15 years, Joe has been working with grassroots organizations to promote right-based approaches to forest protection. So with that, Joe, it would be fantastic if you can come here to the front.
Hi everyone. I'm Joe from the Rainforest Foundation, and I'm going to talk a bit about 3030 and what are the risks and potential opportunities for local and Indigenous communities in this context. So just to take a step back a few years, RFUK and our local partners in the Congo Basin, we found that around strictly protected areas there are many human impacts. And we got the funding together in 2016 to look at this more systematically. And we looked into, I think it was 35, 36 protected areas. And these are the kind of headline findings. I think 24 of the 35 protected areas had reported displacement of local communities, and 18 had documented reports of human rights abuses. So I think at the time there was this kind of system of biodiversity conservation which was having severe human impacts. But it wasn't until these kind of stories started to appear in the BuzzFeed exposés, which you may recall a couple of years ago, the kind of issue around the human impacts of biodiversity conservation really gained global kind of coverage. And then came draft 0 of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And I don't know if you recall it, but it wasn't great. It was extremely light on language, on human rights, had lots of bad things in it. So we together with, I think it was about 250 Indigenous and community scientists, NGOs, we kind of mobilized on this to kind of highlight the risks of entrenching this model of fortress conservation on local communities. And at the end of it, maybe partly as a result of this advocacy, but also the work of Indigenous organisations working in different ways on this issue, we got some decent language in Target 3 of the GBF, the 3030 target. And I've just highlighted in red the kind of more rightsy, community-based language. And of course, this is an absolute mess of a target. It reflects a very long and arduous series of negotiations that led to this, but at least there is some kind of protections in there for local communities. So in terms of what the kind of overall kind of plus and minuses are of the GBF from our perspective, of course 3030 is an arbitrary number. It's a call to action, but it's arbitrary. It lacks scientific basis and rigor. And of course, achieving kind of a doubling of the protected area coverage around the world within, 7 years is also unrealistic and potentially dangerous if due process and respect for local and Indigenous rights is not respected. Some other things that we'd like to highlight here is that, by conserving 30% of the Earth, maybe you're just displacing biodiversity loss elsewhere. Some other things creeped into the GBF that we're not exactly ecstatic about. Things like nature positive, nature-based solutions, which are a kind of code, I think, for the financialization and the commodification of nature, which we think poses direct threats to local and Indigenous communities in the wrong kind of context. And then also IPLC territories were not explicitly recognized as a category of conservation area, even though there are certain protections. But it wasn't all bad. It wasn't all bad. We managed to get the original GBF text set aside 10% of the Earth as strict nature conservation, and thankfully that was removed from the final text. So that is a definite win. There were some important safeguards in there around the free, prior and informed consent of local communities. And there is possible scope for pushing for kind of Indigenous rights-based approaches to achieving 3030. Okay. So how can we achieve 3030 in an equitable kind of way? So I think most urgently we need to develop some kind of guidance which details how the 30% target can be achieved through the tenure recognition of local and Indigenous communities. Now, one of the things, there's never actually been any review of the effectiveness of the current 17% of the Earth that is under protected area status. So as we move towards 3030, how can we ensure that these areas are equitable, fair, and rights-based? So one of the things that we've been pushing for recently is that how can you establish certain criteria to ensure that new protected areas respect rights? So have they obtained the free, prior and informed consent of local communities? Have they resolved and clarified land claims in the area? And do they have operational and accessible grievance mechanisms? So if you could start to sort of build in these criteria and use that as incentives to kind of push for a more enlightened form of conservation, I think it's potentially quite interesting. And of course, this is all international. This stuff needs to land in local contexts. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is the kind of 3030 in some respects, it's been seen by some as a kind of signal to grab land. So in the Congo Basin, for example, every week there is a new biodiversity offsetting project or carbon offsetting project, which is pretty scary actually. We also need to see how effective the existing protected areas have been in these countries. There needs to be clear, credible pathways to achieving conservation through rights-based models. And finally, kind of fundamental to that is scaling up the mapping and recognition of local and indigenous territories. And then in the Congo Basin, I can pretty much tell you that there's not a square inch of forest that isn't under some kind of customary claim. Now, what we need to do is recognize these territories. So these areas in green, these are community forests based on customary lands. And this is the way that we can achieve 3030 in places like the Congo Basin. Lastly, just a couple of thoughts on the role of private philanthropy, because I think it was mentioned in one of the sessions yesterday about the Protecting Our Planet initiative. So there's been $5 billion that have been dedicated to achieving 3030, which is great. And in many ways, there's certain pluses to that, in the sense that private philanthropy is a lot more flexible. It's a lot more willing to take risks, investing in indigenous organisations that may not have the fiduciary systems that a big international organisation may have. So there's real hope there, but there's also a word of caution in the sense that there needs to be transparency and accountability between how these funds are spent and how these are contributed towards the 3030 target. So I'll stop there because I think I'm just about out of time. But yeah, just to say it's a great time of hope, opportunity, but also risk. And I think in the next couple of years, we really need to get our act together as a community to ensure that this is on a good track. So thanks very much for your time and your attention, and I will see you in a bit.
Thank you very much, Joe. It is good to remember the success in terms of the negotiations of the Global Biodiversity Framework by the IIFB, which is the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. For everyone to be aware, it is the first time that indigenous people's rights were included in one of the goals and in 23 targets. But as you pointed out, Joe, there is still a long way to go. But I think that a foot is on the door, or maybe inside. It is no longer a window. So I think that there's a lot of progress that has been made and even more that needs to get done. So with that, I want to introduce everyone to José Luis Rengifo. José Luis is the coordinator of the process of Black communities in Colombia. It's called the Proceso de Comunidades Negras. And José Luis coordinates a team working on territories and natural resources. José Luis will be speaking in Spanish, so if you do not speak Spanish, please put on your headset so that you can listen to José Luis. And one of the things that he highlighted is that there is a bit of a delay with the interpretation, so be patient. José Luis, the floor is yours.
Ok, buenos días para todas y para todos. Como yo sé que la interpretación del está como un poco lenta, voy a hablar también un poco lento en este marco. Pero antes de la presentación, como lo decía, yo soy José Luis Rengifo, hago parte del proceso de comunidades negras en Colombia, pero además estoy coordinando un proyecto que tiene que ver con la identificación de los territorios colectivos y ancestrales de pueblos negros en América Latina y el Caribe. Esto ha posibilitado que por lo menos, y esto lo estamos haciendo con RRI, y ha posibilitado que por lo menos tengamos unos datos para mostrarles hoy. Por otro lado, nosotros en América Latina sí tenemos que hablar y hacer la diferenciación entre comunidades indígenas y otras comunidades como los pueblos negros o afrodescendientes, ¿sí? No solamente en América Latina hay indígenas, también hay otras comunidades y estas comunidades también tienen que visibilizarse en el marco de las propuestas que estamos adelantando. Lo segundo es que para nosotros hay una concesión del territorio, que el territorio es la vida, ¿sí? Y como el territorio es la vida no se vende, se ama y se defiende. Y ese es un eslogan que siempre hemos tenido presente nosotros. En ese sentido, para los territorios afrodescendientes en América Latina, aprovechando que solamente tengo 8 minutos, nosotros estuvimos trabajando este estudio en 16 países. Y en estos 16 países, bueno, quisiera previamente también decir que antes de esto no teníamos datos, o los datos que teníamos los teníamos por países. Entonces, en el marco de la toma de decisiones para los distintos pueblos negros no teníamos. ¿Cómo me devuelvo? Me adelanté. En la segunda. Ahí, más. Ahí. Entonces, queríamos, se trabajaron en 16 países. Entonces, en los 16 países contamos hoy con 205 millones de hectáreas con presencia de tierras afrodescendientes. Los países en estudio estuvieron básicamente Bolivia, Belice, Brasil, Chile, Honduras, México, Nicaragua, Panamá, Paraguay, Perú, Surinam y Venezuela. Fueron nuestros países inicialmente en estudio y estos pues se convirtieron. Y en esto pudimos identificar que se estima que al menos 403 áreas protegidas están en traslape y en colindancia con territorio identificamos con presencia de pueblos afrocolombianos. Es decir, en América Latina, del total de áreas protegidas, hoy 403 áreas protegidas están en traslape con nuestro territorio. Por lo tanto, esos territorios se convierten también en un escenario para la identificación y la conservación. Por eso identificamos no solamente el territorio, sino cada uno de sus componentes, lo que existe en el territorio. Entonces, en el territorio nosotros podemos identificar que el total de áreas, por ejemplo, tenemos bosques húmedos, tenemos áreas cultivadas en diferentes cultivos transitorios, humedales, arbustos, bosques secos, manglares, ecosistemas marinos y otras coberturas Entonces, estamos hablando de un área de 205 millones de hectáreas en los que estamos haciendo presencia los pueblos afrodescendientes en América Latina y el Caribe. Esto, bueno, nos pone como en dos escenarios. Bueno, para esto creamos un visor que también pueden ingresar en cualquier momento y poder identificar en ese visor que está muy bien, muy didáctico y ya fue publicado hace como más o menos un mes, fue lanzado. ¿Qué queremos plantear nosotros ahorita en términos de territorio? En América Latina las comunidades vienen sufriendo ese proceso en el que no hay una participación real en la toma de decisiones. Y como no hay una participación real en la toma de decisiones, nos hemos convertido en esos sujetos o en esos objetos de investigaciones Hoy, en el marco de los territorios, ejemplo el caso de Colombia, donde hay territorios, donde hay bosque, está el conflicto armado. Entonces, las comunidades nuestras son las que vienen sufriendo ese conjunto de ese exterminio. O sea, casi que nos ha tocado, o sea, tener que salir de los territorios. Por eso hoy estamos diciendo que tenemos 5 valoraciones. Una, la identidad cultural como espacio fuerte para la conservación de los territorios y la permanencia. 2, la visión del ser, es decir, dónde la gente se identifica al interior de sus territorios. 3, creemos que necesitamos seguir sustentando y soportando la necesidad de que las comunidades tienen que permanecer con sus culturas, con sus necesidades al interior de los territorios. Y que para nosotros, repito, el territorio es la vida, así que muchas gracias.
I want to thank Jose Luis because the work that they have carried out with the support of many organizations, including the Rights and Resources Institute, is massive. To map Afro-descendant communities in Latin America and the Caribbean has never been done before, and that is why there has been a lack of recognition of Afro-descendants' role also on managing lands, managing forests in the regions. I don't know how the translation was, but one of the many things that called my attention from Jose Luis' presentation was when he said that the territory is life, right? And as with life, you love your land and you defend your land, right? So I think that that is a core principle that we can see very clearly in the Afro-descendant communities, but also when working with indigenous peoples. So with that, I want to give the floor to our next speaker, Alain Freshet. Alain is the director of the Rights, Climate and Conservation area at the Rights and Resources Initiative. And Alain oversees RRI's analytical programs and thematic work on climate and conservation. So please, Alain, come and share a bit your wisdom with us.
Sorry, how do I? Yes, good morning, everyone. I was asked to give a bit of a recap on the land gap issue. So as many of you know, there's a lot of ambition regarding climate and biodiversity action, and most of those actions depend on land, on forest lands especially. And there's an issue relating to the fact that those lands are occupied and belong to people. So how do we deal with that? So just first off, there are at least more than 2 billion people collectively own land and resources, the most important biodiversity areas and carbon-rich ecosystems on Earth. So these are comprised of indigenous peoples, local communities, and Afro-descendant peoples, as Jose Luis was mentioning. And what they have in common is that they all manage and own used resources collectively. So they have this collective ownership function and title, and that's how they organize and structure their engagement. What's important to realize is that across the world, it's now recognized that the indigenous people, local communities, and Afro-descendants have customary ownership rights over at least 50% of the global landmass. But according to our latest analysis of who owns the world's lands, they actually have ownership rights over only 11%. And when you bring that down to lower and middle income countries, so most developing countries, that percentage drops to 9%. So there's a significant gap in terms of how much land is recognized as owned and managed by communities. And they face growing pressures. Last year there was a report that came out called the Land Gap Report, an answer to the Finance Gap Report and other gap reports that UNEP produces. And therein it was found that in order to meet NDC commitments, countries are calling for action on land that would require at least 1.2 billion hectares of land, mobilize that much land. at least half of that land would be converted, so meaning that we would need to do afforestation on agricultural lands or some other scheme to meet our climate commitments. And when we look at the voluntary carbon market sector, at least 40%, if not more, of investments are all in the land sector. So that's not counting the commitments made by countries. To meet the global biodiversity framework, it's another close to 2 billion hectares of land that will be called into to meet those goals. And the problem is that these two areas don't speak to each other. So there's a disconnect between our commitments on climate and biodiversity, and we're not trying to align these to make sure that there's harmonization across these things. And when we look at who's living there, at least 1.6 to 1.8 billion people would be affected by the conservation movement to try to conserve, protect those lands and resources. And just in the tropics alone, 63% of the lands is unrecognized. So there's a huge issue and challenge that communities are facing in realizing their rights in the context of global commitments. And the challenges don't stop there. In terms of recognizing rights, there are significant procedural restrictions. It's a challenge for most communities to gain access to their land rights, a lot of obstacles in their way. Provisions for free, prior, and informed consent, and especially women's rights, are absent in most countries, so that's a significant gap. All countries, especially in developing countries, are facing increasing incentives not to recognize rights, in fact, rolled back rights with the advent of carbon markets and so on, where that creates disincentives for recognizing rights. And across the board, we see that there is limited legal frameworks for recognizing community contributions to both climate and biodiversity goals. So, for instance, we did a review of carbon rights last year, 2021, and out of 31 tropical forest countries, only 5 had legal frameworks that would recognize carbon rights for communities. And now we're seeing increasingly that countries are nationalizing those carbon rights, and so in fact securing rents from that engagement. And similarly, Joe mentioned biodiversity is a huge gap because there are less than a handful of countries in the world that have legal frameworks that would recognize Indigenous community-led conservation in their agendas. So government support and capacity is weak across the board. Communities do not feature in nationally determined contributions or NBSAP strategies. And there's continuing support in all of the countries in terms of activities that actually threaten rights and nature itself. It's been mentioned on several occasions already during this conference that there's a huge funding gap for communities. Less than 1% of climate financing has gone towards community rights or recognition, and only a fraction of that actually goes to local community organizations. The majority is actually fed through intermediary large conservation groups and so on. There is a critical mismatch between the funding schemes and how to approach that, and how to ensure that communities can access and use those finance and resources. And in terms of sustained climate financing options, they're quite limited. Right now, the only opportunity for them is to engage in carbon markets or nothing at all. There's no in-between. There's no other avenue. Community-based management, use, and governance is a gap everywhere in terms of their ability to engage in decision-making processes that matter to them. Their engagement is again limited. And we see in terms of safeguards, monitoring, and accountability, there's limited social and environmental integrity across all climate, development, and biodiversity commitments across the board. And of course, as Joe mentioned, human rights violations and evictions are happening everywhere. What's important to realize is that community with secure rights tend to outperform all other entities in terms of the deforestation rates, lower deforestation rates. They store more carbon, hold more biodiversity, and benefit more people than all other comparable systems of tenure. And when we look at the potential for recognition, our latest study shows that 102 million hectares of land was recognized between 2015 and 2020. But the actual potential is much greater. If we just implemented existing laws and regulations in 19 countries that have these, we would actually raise that up to 260. But the gap, the 1.3 billion, is the area that we've been able to count in terms of the total area that is unrecognized, that has the potential to be recognized, and actions that we can actually work together to try to secure. So what needs to happen? We need massive support to implement and recognize rights on the ground. So there needs to be more funding, more direct support to accelerate existing laws and regulations. We need to strengthen enabling conditions to support action and make that happen. We need to support governments in realizing the outcomes that are required. Effective engagement, participation, we've mentioned that. Very, very importantly, women's rights need to be prioritized in all of our actions and engagements. And I'd like to just bring your attention to the last one, the Land Rights Standard, which is an initiative that was launched by the Indigenous Peoples Majors Group, Rights and Resources Initiative, and the Global Landscape Forum. It was launched last year. It's a set of 10 principles for how to advance rights, prioritize rights in all landscape-based interventions. And what we're calling for is widespread adoption of this standard as the non-conditional foundation for all engagement with communities. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan. You know, when we think about 63% of the lands being unrecognized in the tropics, among the other things that Alan shared, that is a lot. And at the same time, when those are the lands that are actually showing that the world can achieve through those commitments and rights to indigenous peoples, local communities, Afro-descendant communities, that we can achieve these climate and biodiversity targets. I think that there's a lot of hope on one side, and at the same time, there's a lot of work that we all need to be doing. So our next speaker is Cindy Giulianti. Cindy is the program manager at the ICCA consortium in Indonesia, working for BRWA, which is the Ancestral Domain Registration Body. Cindy is also the advocacy coordinator for the ICCA consortium in Southeast Asia. And if you get to know Cindy, Cindy is very passionate about human rights and conservation. So please, Cindy, I invite you to share.
Can I share from here?
You can share from wherever you want.
Okay, then I think it's more comfortable while sitting, so it's not like lecturing something. But then I would like to share, maybe Elaine and other friends would share about the global context. So I will try to telling stories based on our experience in Indonesia, especially in recognizing ICCE, or Indigenous Community Conserved Areas, and community participation to conservation in Indonesia policy context. Yeah, next. Sure, thank you. Yeah, I think it started in not only in Indonesia, but the other country might be also having this kind of principle, domain for clearing at the first time in the Dutch colonization period in Indonesia, that recognize the uncertified land, or the lands that cannot prove the ownership of the land will be recognized as state lands. And it's going to be the way of the states to encroach many of the uncertified land, including for indigenous peoples and local community. And it has been strengthened in the 60s and also until now through agrarian law and forestry law and conservation law in Indonesia. And it's really affecting indigenous people's land in Indonesia. Now, the protected areas, the encroachment in the name of conservation itself has been strengthened and expanding. Now we have more than 556 protected areas, covering more than 27 million hectares in Indonesia. And of course, it's resulting in a very long-term conflict between indigenous peoples and the managers of the protected areas. In Indonesia, we quoted some fact from HUMA and also human rights commissions recorded some conflicts, especially in protected areas. So, yeah, I would like to say also the relation between tenure rights and conservation. Why, of course, when we talk about conservation, we will need also to discuss about the tenure rights. Here from this map, I think we can illustrate that from the 27 million hectares of the protected areas, this 4.5 million is actually ancestral domains. So it was developing with the protected areas, and unfortunately, until now, there's only about 900,022 20,000 area recognized as ancestral domain within the protected areas. It's very, it's so small rather than the registered ancestral domain that we have been collected covering 25 million hectares. And of course, when it comes to customary forests, for example, the government only recognized 153,000 hectares of the customary forest. Our estimations and potential of the customary forest in Indonesia even reaching more than 18 million hectares. So it's a very small achievement. This is the analysis report, Global Reform by ICC Consortium. I believe that we can all show and see actually the fact that indigenous peoples' territories really contributing to the biodiversity conservation. Even 22% of the ICCAs or indigenous conservation areas is located in this world. And then we have also total global area, from this total global areas of the world, 21% is potential ICCA. So what I'm going to say is that indigenous peoples and local communities are really contributed to the nature conservation. The next is that I want to invite us to reflect about what is exactly conservation is for us. Because there's a gap of knowledge from the scientists on the conservation and the local knowledge about the conservation itself. We documented many of ICCAs or practices of conservation carried out by indigenous peoples and local community in all of typical of the ecosystem. They have in a forest area, they have in a lake, they have in the seas area, and so on and so forth. But somehow, what we cannot understand, people that, especially the decision maker, couldn't make it through this understanding, that because the knowledge of indigenous people might not be unmatched, is not matching with the policy itself. For example, when it comes to one example here, it's Lubang Titipan is actually a conservation area in Kasepuhan in Indonesia. So they actually conserve local farming system. Somehow the government would not say that it's not conservation, but because they practice this local farming system, they can conserve local paddy. Where the grain revolution is coming, they damage all the type of native paddies there, but they can survive. They can protect the local paddy, and in the other side, because the local farming is ban the use of pesticide, chemicals, and so forth, they can conserve the extant habitat or certain animals and biodiversity. But it never counted as conservation. Why? I think we need to also reflect on this thing. Maybe the conservations on certain species is not the objective for indigenous people, but they need to do that because they have value, because they have faith, and also they need to keep their ancestor message to protect the lands. But in the other side, it resulted the conservation of outcomes. And because of that, I think it's also considered in the CBD in the end of the day. So, and this is also the other example in Sasi. Sasi is also in the coastal and marine areas. There's a lake and so on and so forth. You can see further in our website. This is the distributions of the ICCA and the potential of the ICCA in Indonesia. We estimated there's a 4.2 million hectare potential of the ICCA. This is indicative, which means when it comes to the indicative, all the indicators of the analysis has been more significant. But then I think it's very small number from the estimate in ancestral domains. And then here, I think the last is talking about the policy context, policy opportunity we have in national level is now National Biodiversity and Action Plan, or NBSAP, yeah. But unfortunately, when it comes to the NBSAP, because it's not coming out from the legislative process, it couldn't be tightened, it couldn't be mandatory for certain government body. And it's only become a reference document. And because of that, somehow it cannot be implemented well. So I think we need to really thinking about how to ensure the legislative process of the NBSAP so it can be direct reference and there's a impact impact when the government couldn't implement this NBSAP. And the second of all is actually the Communing Montreal Biodiversity Framework, especially for the targeting. For us, is really important because of why? Because some of the government still thinking that in the implementation of that targeting is only expand the expanding of protected areas without actually also considering other target. That's of course going to be a very, it's going to be threat for indigenous people if the expansions of protected areas also do not really consider other targets such as FPIC, or it's also considering other practices of indigenous conserved areas in the world. So therefore, we are really encouraging and how could we really advocating the interpretations of the target 3. So it would not only about the quantity of how we expand the protected areas, but about how to ensure the just process on the mechanisms. I think that's all for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cindy, for your presentation. I am always shocked when I see that probably 60% or a bit more of protected areas in Indonesia are overlapping with indigenous peoples and traditional peoples' territories, right? And the recognition that we constantly have to fight against this idea that traditional and indigenous people's knowledge is subservient to Western knowledge, right? When they have been living in those places since time immemorial and when they know the places better than anyone else. So thank you very much for your presentation, Cindy. And our last panelist today is Katie Ratar. Katie is a senior researcher associate at WRI, and she supports the Land and Carbon Lab initiative. Katie leads also the technical research on forest restoration monitoring at a global scale. So yeah, Katie.
Can you hear me? Okay. I think I'll sit here as well. Cindy's a trendsetter, and I'll follow her lead. So I'm going to be presenting some research that we released earlier this year in a blog, which is a study analyzing carbon sinks and sources in the Amazon region, specifically as it relates to indigenous peoples and local community-held forests. And I thought this was an interesting study to present in the context of the summit because it's, it's about harnessing data and seeing how it can be applied in a policy research context. So not just producing data for the sake of having lots of data, but how can we harness the many data layers that are available now to say something meaningful that has policy implications and affects millions of people. I also want to recognize two colleagues at WRI who were instrumental in this analysis. David Gibbs, who produced a lot of the technical analysis and the carbon flux modeling, which you can find on Global Forest Watch, and Peter Veit, who's a senior fellow at WRI and has worked in the land rights space for many years. So to provide some background on the data and methods, we conducted an analysis of carbon fluxes in the Amazon bioregion for the period of 2001 to 2021. And it was a geospatial analysis, and the main inputs were indigenous and community lands that were sourced from Landmark, which is a global platform of indigenous and community lands. It aggregates data from many different local and regional sources into a global map, and also forest carbon emissions and sequestration estimates from Nancy Harris and David Gibbs and their team and key partners that was released in 2021. And so just as a quick reminder, net carbon flux is defined as the gross emissions from forest loss and tree cover loss, deforestation, minus gross sequestration, being the absorption of standing forests and growing forests, absorption of CO2, I mean. And so we looked specifically at the Amazon bioregion for this study, and we defined it in one of the more extensive ways. It includes all or part of 9 countries, so Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, French Guiana, Guyana, Peru, Suriname, and Venezuela. And indigenous people hold about 29% of the bioregion, and almost half of that is in Brazil. And so we looked at the bioregion as a whole, as well as each country individually to see how they compare. I'll talk about that a bit more later. But we found that 94% of indigenous and community-held forests in the Amazon bioregion were a net sink. And so it varied country to country from 99% to 75% in Bolivia, but overall it was overwhelming that they were net sinks. Emissions were concentrated in a small fraction, just 6%. If you look at the map here on the screen, the light green is the forest area, the dark green are the indigenous and community-held forests that are the sinks, and the purple are the sources where there are more emissions than sequestration, and there are very few, as you can see, mostly, the ones you can see on the map here, mostly on the southern boundary. And so looking at it in aggregate, so collectively, the indigenous held forests emitted an average of 120 million tons of CO2 equivalent and removed 460 million tons of CO2, making them a net sink of 340 million tons. And that is the equivalent of sequestering the UK's annual fossil fuel emissions. So it's quite a significant amount of sequestration. And you can see that on the left-hand side of this graph. And when you break it down country by country, our analysis of emissions and removal showed that all 9 countries were net carbon sinks during the time period of 2001 to 2021. And it's also an interesting thing to note here that the magnitude of removals and emissions can be interpreted to show how secure these carbon sinks are. So a higher ratio, so when the purple and green bars are both high or high relative to or the purple is high relative to the green, it's less secure. But when the green is much bigger than the purple, as on this graph here, it's closer to becoming a source. So for example, indigenous forests in Bolivia and Peru have in Bolivia and Peru, both had higher emissions relative to removals, and so they're closer to turning into sources than, say, in Brazil, which has a much higher sequestration, like green bar than purple bar there. And so now on the flip side of that, looking at Amazon forests outside of indigenous lands and indigenous held territory, they were a net carbon source within the bioregion. Outside indigenous lands, there was emissions of 1.3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent per year due to deforestation. And there was a removal of 1 billion tons of CO2 per year. And the difference there is a net source of 270 million tons of CO2 equivalent. And that is equivalent to the emissions from France in a single year. And that you can see that on the right-hand bar graph. So breaking it down again, country by country, you can see here that Brazil pretty much dominates the results. They had 3/4 of the total loss, and that they were generally the driving factor. And the other countries are just kind of dwarfed by Brazil's results. and they essentially counteracted the effects. In some countries there were sinks, in some countries outside indigenous lands it was sources, but Brazil really dominated it, turning into a net source overall. And so stepping a bit back, just to talk a little bit about global significance, we looked only, of course, in this study at the Amazon region. We focused mainly on that area because we had the best data for indigenous and community lands for that region. It's typically better mapped than other parts of the world. But really looking at the three major rainforests in the world, being the Amazon, River Basin, Congo, River Basin in Southeast Asia, these are places where there is a strong indigenous and community presence. And so these are really important areas of the world. And hopefully in the future, when we get better data on indigenous and community lands in those areas, we can do a similar analysis. And so, not sure where that came from, but yeah, I had a few recommendations. So boiling down the results into some, those kind of key takeaways. I think a lot of these have been mentioned already, but just, mainly to recap, it is really important to recognize the contribution of community lands in meeting national climate commitments, NDCs. In countries that have large forest areas, it would be very important to make them a key, community held forests, make them a key component of climate action strategies. As Ellen was saying, very important to secure and protect community lands, to capitalize on, there have been many studies showing that it's a low-cost, high-benefit mitigation measure compared to some of the higher-cost sequestration options. Increasing funding to communities for forest management and protection is really important. As we just saw, less than 1% of development assistance typically goes directly to communities anyway. And so increasing that ratio would be really important for helping communities to manage their forests and protect them. And so finally, expanding mapping of indigenous and community lands would be important to recognize, to show where they are and show how they contribute significantly to climate change mitigation. And lastly, so on this last point about mapping indigenous and community lands, this here is a picture of the Landmark platform. It's a as I mentioned before, it's a global platform that aggregates data on indigenous and community lands globally. Currently, we have about 13% of the world's indigenous and community lands on the platform. There's an estimated 50% though. And so we are actually, through a grant from Bezos Earth Fund, we're looking to expand that coverage and work with local organizations, regional organizations to increase the area that is mapped so that the 50% can no longer be an estimate, but we can do more of these analyses and produce more research on exactly how these lands are contributing to global climate mitigation. Thank you. Yeah, and the blog is online at wri.org if you would like to read about the study in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie. The numbers are really impressive and they make a very strong case on why indigenous peoples and local communities, territories matter in terms of ensuring the health of our planet. So before I ask a question to all of you, I am wondering whether any of you have questions for our panelists. Or maybe I start with a question while you all get inspired. When listening to all of you, it is clear that the case has already been made, right? The information is there. In these days, we see that there is more and more information available about the importance of indigenous peoples and local communities' rights over their lands, as well as self-determination, right? So I am curious not the barriers that we see in terms of policy, in terms of funding, etc., but what are the barriers from your perspective that we have as a sector to share these messages and actually move forward and have others hear it, right? Because I think that that is one of the spaces that we have to open doors, right? When I see all of you here, it is fantastic that you are all here, but at the beginning of the session, it was clear that most of us are already working on this, right? And we would love to have a room full of people that are also wanting to learn more about these issues. So what do you think are the barriers that we need to overcome in order to share better this message? And I know that this is a tricky question because there were a set of questions, but listening to all of you, I just play my Ecuadorian card and change the plan. So I don't know whether anyone wants to answer. Lo que acabo de preguntar es que los datos que ustedes presentaron muestran claramente que los pueblos indígenas y las comunidades locales están publicando. Y la pregunta es, ¿por qué tenemos esa barrera de que otros entiendan esto más allá del tema de política o de crecimiento? Pero cuando estamos aquí en esta reunión y estamos todos los bienvenidos acá adentro, ¿cuáles son nuestras propias barreras para que otros nos escuchen? ¿Cuáles son sus perspectivas al respecto? Yeah, I don't know who wants to go first. Yeah.
Does this work? Yeah? Okay. I think it's a complex question and a delicate one to answer. But I think the first thing that comes to mind is the fact that this is perceived as a political issue in most circumstances. And therefore, it's a political decision of governments, of national governments, to recognize or not. And it's it's democracy in action, but unfortunately, a lot of people don't want to get their feet wet with democracy. We like it when it's functioning and it's on the side, but actually engaging in this process of advancing rights actually requires you to step forward and acknowledge that there are critical rights issues that are not being addressed, and if we don't start talking about it, we're not going to make headway. But it's much easier to just avoid that discussion, talk about technicalities and technical stuff, because then everybody can agree on that. It's apolitical. It's easy. There's agreement around principles for that, but around principles for democratic engagement and advocacy and doing things that might put some constituencies uncomfortable, especially governments in this case, or private sector corporations. So how do we break down those barriers? I think there are credible ways, and what we do at RI is it would create a lot of convening, bringing people together, basically demonstrating that there is higher costs for companies and countries for not realizing and working on rights. And when you can get that message across that actually it's hurting you more and it's costing you more not to address it, then you can get people at the table and start having conversations around how to resolve it. How do we do that in the international arena? I'm not sure. It's easier almost to do it with companies directly in countries than it is with the international arena. I've had mixed experiences in my short career with trying to get various multilateral organizations to engage on this. But I'm curious to hear what others have experienced.
Yeah, sure. I just got a couple of things to add to this at the moment. I think, two kind of key barriers is scale. As I said, through our Mapping for Rights program, we've supported around 1,000 communities to map their lands with geospatial technologies. That represents about 4% of the Congo Basin region. And as I said, I think pretty much the entire forest is under some kind of customary claim. So it's how you scale up, how you build that capacity, how you ensure kind of good standards in the mapping work. A second barrier, I would say, would be the government buy-in. I think at this conference, they're kind of conspicuous by their absence, and we're all talking to ourselves, as it's been said. And there's kind of opposing forces here, isn't there? I think in the DRC, the government is attempting to lift the logging moratorium on new concessions, and if that is lifted, then that imperils tens of millions of hectares of forest and customary rights. You've also got things like oil and gas development, the push for carbon, and as I said in my presentation, this green rush. So it's about how to kind of get that government buy-in and how you can build in incentives for governments to do the right thing. And it's messy work, but it's something that we need to address because we'll only make limited progress without it. Thanks.
Ok. Yo siempre he ubicado como tres cosas. Es decir, la primera es cómo nos estamos viendo entre las instituciones y las comunidades. ¿Sí? Entonces, normalmente, y como decía Alan, es cómo nos convertimos también en ese escenario de generación de capacidades internas al interior de las comunidades que permitan no solamente mirar lo técnico por lo fácil que es, sino mirar también todos estos otros escenarios que intervienen en el desarrollo de las comunidades para poder construir un escenario en el que efectivamente podamos plantear cosas interesantes. Lo segundo es esa mirada de pensarnos que somos sujetos nada más, ¿sí? O que somos objetos de una investigación, objetos de un trabajo, objetos, y cómo podemos mirar al otro distinto. O sea, en este escenario podemos hablar de muchas de esas cosas, pero al interior de las comunidades necesitamos también ir reduciendo también, y repito, ese proceso de generación de capacidad interna que permita poder dejar esa capacidad, porque el tema de los proyectos a veces también se convierte en un problema. Entonces yo hago un proyecto para la comunidad, se terminó la financiación y me fui, pero la comunidad queda ahí con una infraestructura que no, o sea, esas tecnologías no apropiadas que finalmente sirvieron porque estaba el proyecto y no sirven porque van a desarrollarse. Es decir, la parte política, lo técnico, tiene que generarse una mistura alrededor de esas dos cosas para poder construir y generar capacidad al interior de los territorios. Y lo tercero, la financiación. La financiación tiene que recoger también el involucramiento mucho más directo de los individuos de las comunidades. Yo creo que si, ¿cuál es la barrera? Repensar y pensar que efectivamente quienes están trabajando con nosotros, con quienes estamos trabajando, requieren también de un compromiso más directo y mucho más allá de pensar en un empleo.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. I think what I'm going to say from your question is that, yeah, even though many people say that maybe the COP15 is a big win for Indigenous people, I think it's not enough. Because, again, it's going to be really depend on the national policy context and political will. But what I learned from our experience in the grassroots level is that I think the collaborations is the key. So I think we need to keep interventing those who might be not intervened by this issue, especially Indigenous peoples and their human rights, maybe those who are working with the species or whoever. But we need to keep collaborating with those people, including, I think this is also the platform for us, this summit, is to meet those people who might be not working directly with us, but we can collaborate to do something in the future. And it's really important. And the second of all, I think, is the networking and the leadership from the local champion. That's why in Indonesia, we are trying to establish something that we call ICCA Custodian Network. So because we believe that in the future, the indigenous people need to voices themselves, their needs, their rights, their willingness, and their leadership towards what we actually discuss in many occasions. And the third, of course, not only the leadership from those who are having that rights, but also the leadership from the decision makers. And the indigenous peoples, in many cases, can be able to become decision makers. They can be decision makers. So I think it is really important to also identifying those leaders and champions who can collaborate and strengthen our movement for this conservation and climate agenda.
Sure, I can be very brief. I think these are all really good points. And I mean, one thing I appreciated in listening to the various presentations today is just the kind of the different issues at the different scales, like with Cindy working at national level, and then Jose Luis at both project level, but then also aggregating to regional. It's just really interesting and then the global presentations here as well, just how it's a bit different in how you approach the issue. But I would just want to echo what Cindy was saying about the collaborations and kind of bringing in the different sectors, and just as I mentioned before, kind of harnessing this data that we are producing, a lot of different people are producing, but just how do we use it to make the case? How can we bring people in and kind of connect the dots on all the different activities going on, all the different research, all the different data production going on to really make a movement around it and go from there. Thank you.
I saw Tasso. Tasso, you had a question, but maybe first we go to you.
This is coming from my community. They are watching. So it's actually for Elaine, but the others can answer too. And it's a question about supporting indigenous people. You were talking about supporting indigenous people regarding legal land rights. What can we do, or what ideas do you have for countries where the government consciously do not want to recognize indigenous land rights because they have their own interests, as gold mining in indigenous land? What would your strategy be in those kind of cases? What kind of ideas can you give us? Thank you.
Can I follow up? It's just in the same lines. One thing that we are seeing in some cases in Brazil, other places, is that the carbon red initiatives, it may be opportunity, but also maybe a threat. And the threat that we are seeing is that people start to see that they can receive payments for the forest, and so it gets more difficult to actually assign or recognize the indigenous lands. It's not the indigenous lands is less in Brazil, but in the case of the quilombolas, that's a real issue, because it gets much more expensive to declare the land, recognize the land, because then you have to if you have any red project initiative, that will have a value that you have kind of to pay back to whoever set the project before. So I'm just curious if it's like more an opportunity or more a threat.
Perfect. And yeah, Alan, a question was asked directly to you by our friends, the Wayana people in Suriname. So,
yeah, well, Tasso's question's a bit easier to answer, but maybe in response to your question. So there are lots of strategies. Communities vary in how they approach this, and there are I don't think there's a winning formula out there. What we do know is that it requires at least 3 ingredients. One, community capacity to organize and advance their rights, and so it's the capacity to advocate, to mobilize collectively, and have strong messages in terms of clarity. What is it that they want, and to be able to have arenas where they can engage with government counterparts, with other counterparts, and have open discussions around how to do this. What we do is we provide them, we support them in collecting the data, the evidence to advance their rights. We create convenings where we bring government representatives, community representatives, private sector as well. Very important. There's a platform called the Interlocking Group, which brings together multinational corporations such as Nestle, Unilever, IKEA. They sit together with Indigenous rights representatives, and we bring them together at the country level. And that attracts governments, it attracts others, and then it's a way to get buy-in and agreement around addressing these things. So capacity, but it also requires government capacity. Very few governments actually have the resources and technical know-how to make that happen. There's no money directed towards this thing. There's nobody's supporting this. So there's been over a decade of UN readiness investments. None of that money has gone towards supporting governments to realize rights on the ground. And so that's a critical gap, and the World Bank and other institutions can play a role, but they're not stepping up to that, and more action is needed. So capacity, government willingness, and then the legal reforms, of course, required to get there. And some of the strategies are now being used by communities. Instead of advocating for rights, they're advocating for livelihood opportunities. So demonstrating use of land and demonstrating that they bring value in terms of economic returns, food security, ecological ecosystem services, which are now, of course, what we're here for. Being able to demonstrate that also demonstrates value, and that is used as an entry point for engagement, and then once they secure rights to use the land, then they can advocate for securing rights to own the land. But it's circuitous, there are no direct paths, but there are, interestingly, maybe one last thing on that is that there are now dedicated mechanisms, investment platforms, which didn't exist before, like the tenure facility, like the new community land and conservation finance initiative that RI launched. There are now territorial funds being developed across the world. And these provide a new, unexpected resource flow for direct financing to communities to support their engagement, which has been lacking altogether up until recently. So this is very exciting and very promising because all of a sudden now there are resources, and communities can request money and support to RI or other institutions to directly advance their priorities. Maybe quickly on Tasso's comment, and I'm sure others will want to comment. I think the evidence is bearing the fact that countries are realizing that carbon is a source of rent. And we're seeing nationalization of carbon rights increasingly. Zimbabwe just announced something on this. Kenya is doing the same thing. So we're seeing progressive nationalization of carbon rights. So what does that mean for communities? It's unclear because they get a certain percentage, but what's this percentage based on? Oftentimes it's based on legally recognized rights, but the problem is that 2/3 of their lands aren't recognized. And so if the 2/3 aren't recognized, what's the proper balance? There's a case in Guyana recently of recognizing only 15%, which is what they legally own, but in reality it's much more than 40. So how do you balance that out? And that creates a disincentive for governments to recognize rights, because land rights even, because most legislation ties land rights, carbon rights to land rights. So if those two are not connected and done well, then there's no incentive to engage. And so how do we change that dynamic? I think all of the people here and elsewhere have a duty to just keep reminding folks that we're in this together, that we need to cooperate and play well and play fairly and equitably. So I'll stop there, and I'm sure my colleagues have other things to say.
Any other reflections? I see Cindy.
Yeah, I think for answering the question, I think it's also become one of the complicated issue for the carbon in Indonesia, because we cannot talk about it without land rights. I agree with that. I mean, like the first obstacles I think that we need to face is to ensuring the land rights, because my illustrations in the map is that showing that whether it's going to be protected, whether it's going to be incentive of carbon and everything, but without recognitions for land rights, we cannot really be able to say who's this, belong to. this incentive, this carbon, this, every single idea of this global world, But then, the most important thing is to ensuring that we have best support for indigenous people for the recognition.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, yeah, just to echo Alan's point around lack of funding for government. I think the international funding architecture, the institutional funding architecture is becoming more compliance heavy, more risk averse. And working in the Congo Basin and with the local administrations that are supposed to administer things like community forests, they have nothing, absolutely nothing. So until we manage to take that leap and kind of invest those and be aware of the risks that are attached to that, we're not going to make any progress. Another thing is in terms of getting government buy-in is how to incentivize governments through biodiversity and climate funding. To ensure that they recognize rights. And it's weird because a lot of what we do is trying to decolonize conservation, but in a sense, it's kind of going back the other way in that you put certain conditionality on biodiversity and climate funds so that governments recognize community rights. So it's a sort of interesting tension that we work with. And then in terms of the opportunities and threats with carbon, it's more likely to work in places where communities have secure tenure rights. However, I mean, we're just about to publish some research in 2 weeks, actually, which compares and contrasts the so-called high-integrity carbon initiatives that are supposed to ensure good social practice and so on and so forth. And what we found was that most of them are unlikely to, because they don't put enough emphasis on rights and carbon ownership. Another key issue is the fluctuating price of carbon. Around COP26, around the euphoria around RED and all these kind of forest commitments, the price of carbon rose to sort of touching $20 a ton, which is kind of the level that you might need to incentivize forest change on one level or another. It's now $1.50 a ton, and as more RED projects, more carbon projects come on stream, it's going to tank even further. So whether the markets are ultimately going to save forests is a big question for us. And then just to say, I mean, now you've got the emergence of biodiversity offsets as well, which are probably more complicated and more problematic than carbon, because by their very nature, is biodiverse. So how can you modify something that is biodiverse? And that's the next thing, I think, that is going to be that we need to keep an eye on.
Thank you so much to all of the panelists. I see that there is one question, and we will have one person answer the question. That it will be the last question. Please.
Okay, thank you for this presentation. My question is on that very point, and I think it applies to both carbon credits and biodiversity credits. In order to create a credit and for it to become a capital asset, it has to have certain conditions attached to it. And those conditions can mean that the land can restrict how the land is used. So what does it, can you explain to me who actually basically owns and decide what happens to the carbon in the trees in a circumstance where the land is owned by indigenous peoples or local communities, but the carbon assets are perhaps owned by others, or the thing that is called a credit, so to speak. I'm not sure I fully understand how that works, so I was hoping you could help me understand.
Okay. Yeah, it's a good question. What can I say? I think a lot of it, depends on there being good community governance. So, if indigenous peoples often have very accountable, transparent kind of decision-making structures and in terms of how they manage the forest and whatnot. But I also think that often RED projects are just paper projects. So they don't actually do anything in reality. The project developers may inflate the baseline, so it looks like they're generating carbon and saving carbon, but that's not what they're doing at all. And they generate fictitious credits, which then go on the market and so on. So it very much depends on the context, and I'm not quite sure I answered your question properly, but yeah.
But Yeah, you want to go there, or maybe we can, I know a couple of you that know a bunch about this, so, because we just have 5 minutes, whether we can stay for 5 minutes after the
Maybe just a very quick response. Like others in this room, I've been engaging in the Red Plus arena for over a decade. I have yet to understand how it works. Have yet to get somebody to explain to me concretely, what does it mean for a community 20 years down the road, 30 years, 50 years? What does it mean in terms of their ability to use the land and so on? And it's extremely complex, and most people, most communities don't really understand what they're signing on to, yet alone the experts. So there's a lot of uncertainty tied to this, but what we do know is that if you don't own the carbon that's in the trees, you essentially, even if you own the tree, you don't actually own the tree because you can't use it. And you can't, unless there are, there are now, I do know that there are projects that allow for communities to meet their needs, to meet their subsistence needs, to, some level of livelihood engagement and so forth. But ultimately, will those conditions change over time? What are the restrictions that will happen? Contracts come and go. They can get amended over time. We don't know 20 years what that means. 100 years, who's going to keep these things up? How are they going to? I think there's a lot of uncertainty, and most people are struggling to understand this. Even if you engage in it and you promote it, yeah. Anyway, I'll just stop there.
There's a lot to talk about that. That can be an entire different session, and probably an entire different day, but thank you very much for your question. I want to thank all of the panelists for coming here, so if we can give them a big applause for sharing all of their experiences and actually making the case for why it is important to recognize Indigenous peoples and local communities' rights. And at the same time, I know that many of you are ready to go to another session, or maybe to catch a flight, or maybe to eat something. But I couldn't finish this session without sharing a bit of energy with all of you. So I decided that I wanted to share a song. I am not gonna sing, so don't worry about it. I already sing when I speak, but that's a different question. But this song is from a Tongan songwriter and singer. Her name is Mia Kami. This is an Indigenous woman that it is really, really committed to Indigenous sovereignty, and I thought it would be a nice way of ending the session. So let's see whether this works.
Once pristine, once untouched, once pure, all of that's no